please welcome retired Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, 25th National Security Advisor, for a discussion on what winning looks like with Jeanne Meserve, host of SCSP's NatSec Tech podcast.
Welcome. I don't really have to introduce this guy. You know who he is. A retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General, also former National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster. Thank you so much for being here today.
Hey, Jeanne, great to be with you. Great to be with everybody.
A lot to talk about. I want to start with Ukraine and this drone attack, which was stunning and effective. Do you think it changes the trajectory of war or peace in Ukraine?
Well, I think what it does is it maybe is another step in convincing Vladimir Putin that he cannot sustain that war at an acceptable cost to him. The cost of the drone strike is significant. It shows some real vulnerabilities, as have some other very successful Ukrainian strikes, driving the Black Sea Fleet away from Ukraine's shores, the attacks on infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, oil refineries, elements of Putin's war-making machine and industry. And so I think it's important in context of those other actions that impose high costs on Putin to convince him that he's losing the war. I think that's the only way you get to a ceasefire and then some sort of an eventual settlement that's acceptable to the Ukrainians.
What about sanctions?
Sanctions should go way up in terms of enforcement. Europe is still buying a lot of Russian gas and oil. I think it's time maybe for secondary sanctions on entities that are facilitating financial flows into Putin's ATM. And I think there are plenty of other opportunities to increase economic pressure on Putin as well. You've got a lot of pressure on the currency, but especially these piles of cash that he can't convert. He's spending about 50% of his budget on the military, which is unsustainable. He has a huge labor shortage. They're importing essentially slave labor from Africa now, if you've seen who's really working in some of these factories. So I think the time is now to increase the pressure, and with oil prices coming down, that puts even more financial pressure on Putin.
What about this drone attack in terms of what it means for warfare and the shape of warfare in the future? Is it a game changer?
It is a game changer, but it's a trend. And I think that what we have to recognize is that all of us have become like Israel. When Israel had 250,000 Hezbollah rockets pointed at it, its whole society had to get used to defending itself against that third-dimensional threat. We've had a lot of drone incidents here in the United States, some of which we haven't been able to explain. And so I think what we're going to need is a really sophisticated layered defense, something like Israel's Iron Dome against these capabilities, especially critical infrastructure like airports, for example.
So the administration's talking about Golden Dome, which is an iteration of Iron Dome. Does that have to be rethought, perhaps, in light of what just happened in Russia?
Absolutely. I think what you need is a whole range of defensive capabilities, and of course also you need offensive capabilities. For Golden Dome to work, especially against hypersonic missiles, as I think this crowd knows pretty well, you want to be able to get to attack those missiles in the boost phase, or maybe even to be able to preempt an attack altogether with maybe space-based capabilities. And I think maybe you've had some of those discussions here this week. So you need a range of capabilities that span, really almost the globe, but then you need these sort of point capabilities as well, like we've had, in places like Iraq against rockets, the CRAM point defenses as well as the other air defenses, and electromagnetic warfare capabilities. And eventually, I think we're going to have actually pretty close, near on the horizon now, are a range of directed energy systems that are a lot more economical and can be effective against these drones, especially the low, slow drones.
Is there enough money and time and effort being put into drone and counter-drone technologies right now on the part of the U.S. military?
It's the bridge to implementation, right? We have the technologies, and what we have to be able to do is to manufacture at scale and get them into the hands of our armed forces, and we have not done that as quickly as the Ukrainians had. for example, right? And of course, they have a real motivator there. I mean, it's life and death every day. But I think we need to adopt some of that urgency and then also learn, from some of their manufacturing techniques. The way they've innovated is really quite astounding.
Another story ripped from the headlines reports that an Iran nuclear deal, a new one, is in the works. We don't know all the details, but it has been reported that what's being considered now would allow Iran to continue to enrich uranium at a low level. Your thoughts about this potential deal?
Well, I think there are really three variables at work here. One is when inside of Iran. Will that be acceptable to Iran? Iran will want to enrich. We know they're enriching up to 60% now. We know that they have clandestine sites. How do you trust them? So I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on the Trump administration. The second key factor here, what happens inside of the United States, and especially among President Trump's biggest supporters in the Senate and others who have been really adamant about a zero enrichment solution. And then in Israel, will be acceptable in Israel, and of course there are a lot of internal political dynamics in Israel. But I think regardless of who the prime minister is, if it's Netanyahu or if it's Naftali Bennett, I think an Iran that is enriching and is enriching, in a way where we don't have the verification and inspection regime to ensure they're not continuing to go to 60%. Remember, obviously you can't trust the Iranians. They have essentially announced that they're restarting the program they said never existed as a way to generate pressure. So I think it's a combination of factors in terms of enrichment, the verification regime, the degree to which missiles are included, and the degree to which Iran's other behavior as sort of support for terrorists and militias in the region are included. I think what would be acceptable to us is very likely to be unacceptable to Ayatollah Khamenei and the Council of Elders and the IRGC.
I heard another speaker here say that the most imminent threat he believes is a confrontation between Iran and Israel. Would you share that opinion?
Yeah, I think the chances of an Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear program and missile programs and associated infrastructure is like 95%. If you in the next few years. And of course, that's because the Begin Doctrine is still alive and well, which really, from an Israeli perspective, will not permit a hostile state that has announced multiple times that it wants to destroy Israel and kill all the Jews to have the most destructive weapons on earth.
I want to jump over to cyber, critically important domain, certainly. The Trump administration has fired the head of the National Security Administration Agency, and Cyber Command. CISA, which is the arm of DHS, which deals with cyber, has been hollowed out. Does it leave us vulnerable? If you were the Iranians, the North Koreans, the Russians, the Chinese, would you be thinking, window of opportunity here?
Well, I think they'd be wrong to think that because we still have some tremendous cyber professionals who are the best in the world. But what I'm worried about, even more than like the senior level firings that I don't really understand the reason for this. These were talented, dedicated people. I worry also about the gutting of CISA as well, which is a very important bridge into the private sector. And so much of our attack surface that is critical to our national security is in the private sector. So the need for an integrated public-private effort at cybersecurity, which includes obviously everything from detection, the kind of the layered defense, but all the way to recovery of your data, being able to get back up and running again, is really important. But what I'm also worried about is kind of this idea that you need all of your best minds in the private sector, and we need a good percentage of our best minds in government, and we have them, luckily. I think that those who have a microphone to talk about service should be talking about how grateful we are for the extremely dedicated and talented civil servants we have on the job, particularly in the area of cybersecurity.
So you don't think that these actions vis-a-vis cyber agencies have left us more vulnerable?
Not yet. But if the trend continues with this attitude, that it can all just be taken in the private sector. Now, of course, we know we have some of the best private cybersecurity companies in the world. We have some great private now sort of counterintelligence companies and companies that help you recover, from a cyber attack quite quickly. And so we need those private sector capabilities. But you can't have a good defense in cyberspace without a good offense. You have to be able to shoot down the arrows, but you have to be able to kill the archer. And that's what you need some of the best minds in our government to do every day. They're at war every day. And we have to recognize what they're doing for our country and make sure that we have a human capital strategy that brings a good percentage of the top talent in the country into government and into that very important competition.
In testimony before Congress not long ago, you talked about the role of U.S. capital in accelerating China's progress in emerging technologies.
Yeah.
Talk us through that.
Well, I mean, we for many years were underwriting our own demise with smart money investments into Chinese companies that then developed some of their most essential military capabilities. So 2 massive investments from 2 big private equity firms in the U.S. and banks in the U.S. into China in 2014 developed 2 companies. One company does all of the cyber tools for the PLA, and the other does all the battlefield artificial intelligence for the PLA. Hey, congratulations! I hope you got a good return on your investment. How about investments that enable the Chinese Communist Party to perfect their technologically enabled Orwellian police state and to commit, cultural genocide in Xinjiang? These are investments in Hikvision and SenseTime, for example. Then you have the added problem of the dumb money flows that go into Chinese index funds. And of course, as you know, many of these companies are developing naval capabilities and aviation capabilities and other military capabilities, missiles. So I think it's really important for any investment firm, any company, to take a Hippocratic oath, to do no hurt or harm in 3 ways. Don't help the PLA develop the weapons that they might use to kill your children or grandchildren. The second would be, don't help them perfect their police state and extinguish human freedom. And the third would be, don't compromise the long-term viability of your company in exchange for short-term profits. The false promise you always get of access to the Chinese market or of cheap manufacturing.
Should Congress take action on this?
Yes, and Congress has authorized quite a bit for the administration to do. And I think what you're going to see in the Trump administration, there's some really talented people coming into the Trump administration in this area of economic statecraft. That team has not been really confirmed by the Senate yet. So you're starting to see some of that work going on within the administration. But I think what you're going to see pretty soon, maybe next 3 months or so, is a very coherent approach to what I would call Chinese economic aggression. That will include tariffs, because it's a beautiful word. We're going to have tariffs, but also they will include, I think, really pretty stringent, in some cases, export controls, a multinational approach to that, I hope, and then I think really invigorated inbound and outbound investment screening.
So I was recently in Europe, and a lot of people over there feel that the president, with his tariffs, for instance, is being harsher on his friends than his enemies. Is that a way to build alliances and muster our strengths?
Yeah. There's a lot that President Trump is very consistent on, right? In terms of what he wants to achieve. He wants to invigorate economic growth. He wants more resilient supply chains. He wants energy dominance, right? He wants fair trade, reciprocity. Reciprocal, he'd always say, it's my favorite word. And so he wants to address these issues with allies and partners. So that sounds to me like the makings of a positive agenda. So I would say, kind of like the character Oddball in Kelly's Heroes, when he looks to Moriarty, he's always negative. He goes, enough with the negative waves, Moriarty. How about a righteous thought? So let's have a righteous agenda, I think, with Europe. And the president has a lot of space to be tough on Europe, on burden sharing for defense, all that. That's all valid. But it's going in his direction now. So what I'm hoping to see is this positive agenda, and there's a lot we can do together, obviously, on industrial base, on supply chain resilience, on energy security. And the Draghi report, it kind of aligns with us. And then, yes, you need your allies to compete effectively with this axis of aggressors. And you need Canada. Picking on Canada, really? So, if you want the Golden Dome and you want to improve hemispheric defense, Canada's a big part of that. If you care about Arctic security, Canada's a big part of that. So I think what is going to happen is you're going to see a restoration of trust and a common agenda emerge from these tensions. What I used to say to President Trump, and And I think it's an important message, to boil it down. Hey, Mr. President, if we shoot our allies to get to China, China wins. So I think it's important for us to foster a multilateral approach. And we're kind of pushing on an open door with the EU, who's come to the recognition that Chinese economic aggression is a severe threat to Europe's economy as well as their security.
So the title of this session is What Winning Looks Like. Taking inventory of U.S. technology and policy right now. Is this what winning looks like, especially in the face of that axis you mentioned of North Korea, Iran, Russia, China?
Right. I think it almost is, right? I mean, I think we could get tired of winning here pretty soon because even though we've got a lot of issues, and obviously, this budget bill and the increases to the national debt, the growing deficit, I mean, all that is a huge problem. And I'm not an economist, but I hang out with a lot of them at the Hoover Institution. They're all worried about it, which makes me worried. And so I think we have big issues. We have issues in terms of the partisan discourse and how vitriolic it is and how we seem to be polarized and so forth. But you know what? I have great confidence in our democracy. Our democracy is resilient. We have the capacity for self-correction and improvement short of revolution. These axis of aggressors, and I'm including the two revanchist or revisionist powers on the Eurasian landmass of China and Russia, who have pulled in to this fold, Iran and North Korea, I think they look strong from the outside. They look good on parade, but they're actually quite brittle. And so I'm confident. I think there are real economic problems now for Iran, obviously for North Korea, but especially for Russia and China. And I think that we have an opportunity to strengthen our own democracies, to grow our economies, to build prosperity, and to strengthen our alliances.
But we're seeing evidence now of real technology exchange amongst those four powers. Shouldn't our, to use the hackneyed phrase, shouldn't our hair be on fire about that?
Yeah, it's a problem because what you have is obviously this tangible support for one another that is in many ways unprecedented for this group of authoritarian regimes. And of course, each of these countries have their own agendas, but what they share is a common agenda of wanting to tear down the existing rules of international discourse and replace them with a new set of rules that are sympathetic to their authoritarian form of governance, and in China's case in particular, its statist mercantilist economic model. There are estimates, that North Korea has provided $40 billion of support to Russia, the equivalent. I mean, how did it do that? Well, through manpower, 6 to 8 million rounds of artillery, missiles, and so forth. What are they getting in return? And this is what you're alluding to, Jeanne. I mean, they're getting technical assistance with conventional programs, but also their missile programs, and I believe their nuclear program as well. What is Iran getting for the Shahed drones they're providing to Russia? Well, they're getting that same kind of assistance. What's China doing? China's underwriting the entire effort. China is feeding Putin's ATM with energy purchases. China is actually buying 97% of Iran's oil. And they're providing the electronics and the hardware that Russia needs to continue its onslaught on Ukraine. This is what I think is really important. And this is an important message to those who say, oh, the Ukraine war, that's the Europeans, let them deal with that. The war in Ukraine is inexorably connected to our vital interests in other regions of the world. It is part of this broader competition against this axis of aggressors.
And yet we have a president who doesn't seem particularly interested in supporting Ukraine.
Well, I'm sure there are people in the administration making this case. I think the other important, the other important aspect of this is going to be Russia's and Putin's intransigence. I think what's likely going to happen on Ukraine is that President Trump and the administration will back in to a policy that I think some people may have recommended right at the beginning, which is one of more pressure on Putin, sustained support for Ukraine. Maybe in the form of a long-term low-interest loan for the Ukrainians. And I'm thinking of the example of the U.S. loans to Finland after World War I that helped Finland defend themselves against the nascent Soviet Union. A loan, by the way, which was paid back in full. And if we make that loan to the Ukrainians to sustain, because you remember, our supply of ammo, weapons is going to run out in a few months, right? Where's that money spent? That money's spent in the United States. There's a lot of Russian-originated and echoed by useful idiots disinformation out there. But I think it's really important to recognize that it is in our interest to have a sustained commitment to support Ukraine as part, obviously, of a much broader coalition with Europe shouldering more of that burden, which they now are willing to do with the Merz government in Germany in particular.
President Trump has dismissed the man who had your old job, Mike Waltz, as National Security Advisor, and now Secretary of State Rubio is filling that job as well as his primary job as Secretary of State. Should one individual be in both of those jobs?
No, and the reason for this is the National Security Advisor is the only person in the national security and foreign policy establishment who has the president as his or her only client. And your job as National Security Advisor is to coordinate and integrate across the departments and agencies to provide the president with best advice and multiple options so the president can determine his own agenda. If there's, the Secretary of State is doing that, he has kind of a dual responsibility to his own department. And of course, none of the other cabinet officials really work directly for the Secretary of State. So it is this ability for the National Security Council staff and the National Security Advisor to convene the departments and agencies and to help frame the complex challenges and opportunities we're facing and provide the president with best advice and multiple options. That is a critical function. I think somebody convinced President Trump, based maybe on parts of his experience in his first administration, that his own staff would be the biggest obstructionist. Actually, it's his staff who can help drive his priorities. And where you encounter, I think, the greatest bureaucratic inertia is oftentimes in those departments and agencies. So I just think the NEC and the NSC are vital to driving the president's agenda, helping the president identify his agenda, running a deliberative process, which I think would be kind of nice on some of these issues like tariffs, to clarify what you're trying to achieve and to come up with options that are, are optimal for accomplishing your objectives.
And yet, not only has he dismissed the advisor, he's also let go reportedly half of the staff, national security staff at the White House. Can half the people do the whole job?
I think it depends. Maybe. So what you need is, you need a team in place on the National Security Council staff, first of all, who understands their role. Their role is not to implement policy, right? Nobody wants to get the Oliver North Award, on the NSC staff. But also to understand that their job is not to make the policy themselves, but to run the process that allows that kind of collaboration and framing so that you get really a clear understanding of the nature of the challenge you're facing. Understand the vital interest, the so what is at stake, what are the key objectives and the goals that you're trying to accomplish, what are the obstacles of progress, what are the opportunities, and how do you integrate all elements of national power and efforts of like-minded partners to advance America's vital interests. You need a team who understands how to get that done across the departments and agencies. In many cases, these are people, most cases, they have to be people who can lead by charm, who can build a team across those departments and agencies. And they have to have two really key areas of expertise. Expertise about the challenge that they're working on, the national security challenge that they're working on. And the second is knowledge of the resources that can be brought to bear, from government in particular, but also from like-minded partners internationally, and to some degree from the private sector. So you need people with that competency. That competency is what is most important. And if the function is as I described, then you can maybe rebuild the form to that function. So the numbers of people are not as important, I think, as people who understand their role, and then who have the competencies of in that area, and also in the resources that they can bring to bear.
We can now say RIP to USAID. And Secretary Rubio has made moves to slash the foreign aid budget. Is that a mistake? Does that affect our ability to exert American influence overseas?
Well, USAID had drifted, okay, and I think in the last 4 years in particular, and I don't know if any of you saw Senator Cruz's report on some of the programs that were funded. It was just jaw-dropping. It was ridiculous, right? And so what should you do in this case? Should you just crush the entire organization, or recognize that there is a mission for that organization to advance American interests, tie that more closely to the efforts of the State Department so you have an integrated approach, which many secretaries of states wanted, right, including Hillary Clinton, to diplomacy and development. And so I think that would have been a much better approach. The same thing with the NED and RI and other organizations. Could they be improved? Yes. Same thing with research in universities. Is there too much overhead in these universities? Are the service fees they're charging too high? Yeah, maybe. Are some of the research tangential to our national interests that's federally funded? Yes. So I think this is where you have an opportunity to really reform and to change effectively, but not to just slash and burn, because we do have, I think, really we do benefit tremendously from, I think, strengthening democratic institutions and processes. I think that's the best way to compete with the Chinese Communist Party, for example, in developing countries. One of the best ways, by shining the light, pulling the curtain back with investigative journalism, really ensuring people have a say in how they're governed, a judicial process that can go after some of the corruption associated with Belt and Road, for example, as occurred in Ecuador and other places. So I just think we have to focus those organizations on their mission and resource that mission, integrate it more with what we're doing from a diplomatic perspective. So I have no problem with USAID being under the Department of State. But there is still a development function that is important and relevant to our interests.
I want to go to your old home, the Department of Defense. There have been a lot of retirements, there have been firings, there have been confidential conversations on the Signal app. Do you believe U.S. warfighting capability has been compromised?
I don't think it's been compromised. I do think it's sort of under duress a bit, and the Department of Defense was under duress, I would say, based on the Biden administration's pushing of a political and social agenda on the military that was inimical to the warrior ethos and military effectiveness.
You're referring to DEI?
I would say DEI as defined as equality of outcome rather than equality of opportunity, as well as what I would call the valorization of victimhood, and these reified philosophies, these postmodernist philosophies and critical theories that we're teaching some of our servicemen and women anyway, that you should judge the servicemen and women next to you not by their courage, their honor, their commitment to the mission and to one another, the willingness to sacrifice for you, but their identity category. And I think that's just ridiculous. Not only is it ridiculous, it's destructive to unit cohesion. Now, I'm also concerned, though.
Was that really what was happening, or was there an effort to create equality of opportunity within the services?
There was some crazy stuff going on. I mean, I'll leave you to others to take a look at it. But from what I know, what I've witnessed, actually, it was this was not the military, the uniformed military. These were civilian appointees pushing this radical agenda. Now, is it possible, and does it seem like the cure could be worse than the disease? Yes, right? I mean, I'm also worried about the correctives that are being put in place, and some of the ideas that it's really the uniformed military that was pushing these political or social agendas. The military was not pushing this. These were civilian appointees. And I think it's really important for our political leaders not to try to drag the military, the uniformed military, into partisan politics. That would be destructive to our professional military ethic and to our institutions.
Leave us on a positive note. Something good to say about what's happened?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot that's long overdue that we're putting into place now. I mean, if you think about President Trump's agenda, okay, I mean, if it's deregulation, it's invigorating economic growth, it's energy security, it's peace through strength. We'll see how that plays out, like in the actual defense budget, allocation resources, capacity of the armed forces. Hey, it's border security, right? I mean, there are a lot of issues at Homeland Defense that's a positive agenda. I think the issue that most Americans have is how the administration goes about some of these items on the agenda. And so that should be a basis for meaningful, respectful discussions. That's what I'm optimistic about, that we can, really not wait for the political class maybe to have these discussions. We need to come together, reject the vitriol, and consider really how we can work together to build a better future. Because I really believe that we can agree on like 80% of what to do. and how to do it. Maybe the 20% we'll never agree on, but I think there's a lot of a common understanding of what we need to do to strengthen our nation, to sort of break free of the kind of self-doubt that we've had, the doubt about our democratic institutions and processes, who we are as a people, and in our ability to achieve favorable outcomes through an effective foreign policy and national security strategy.
General H.R. McMaster, thank you so much
Thanks,
for
Jeanne.
your insights. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.